Hey everybody, this is Chris.
And Jason from Sober Solutions Podcast. Join us as we chat with people from around the globe as they share their real-life stories of recovery.
If you like what you hear, please like and subscribe so you can easily find us and our latest episodes.
And welcome back to Sober Solutions Podcast. Tonight is episode 60. And tonight we have Charlie T. from Wayne, New Jersey with us. Hey Charlie, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you guys?
Doing well, thank you. I'm excited about your topic this evening, talking about recovery in the workplace. And this is very pertinent for me because the last couple months in our Q4 push have just been hellacious and stressful. And I'm very excited for us to get talking on this tonight. But before we get into that, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Like you said, my name is Charlie T. From Wayne, New Jersey. And I guess I'm unfortunate enough, like many people, to really come from a long line of alcoholics and kind of got a double whammy where I have it on both sides of my family, and including some of my siblings. Growing up, life was actually okay. No real like abuse or anything like that in the family. Just the one thing I would say is that we probably didn't really have very excellent role models as parents. As a teenager, kind of felt like same deal that so many teenagers have, going out, having fun with my buddies, playing softball multiple, times a week, and always hitting the bar afterwards. It sort of became like the bar was more fun than the softball game, and one became, sort of like an excuse for the other. But then as I started getting a little bit older in my 20s and in my early 30s, dating, then getting married, I was still going out with the guys. I was still playing them, softball, weeknights, Saturday and Sunday mornings, the whole 9 yards. And it really was almost just like a habit, not just for me, but even like some of my friends, like a real like focal part of our life, even more so than work. Work was just a way to get money, to go out and do those very things. So my wife at the time, she drinks, but she doesn't drink to any kind of excess and doesn't have a problem with it. But I think she thought it was something that I would sort of grow out of. And so did I. And then I thought when kids would come along that would be it. And once again, it wasn't, right? So after a while, I should say, both she and I realized it was like a really big problem for me. And I knew it. So despite the decades that I would ultimately go through, I knew it was a problem. It's funny because I remember recalling that I would say every single time that she and I got into an argument, alcohol was tied to it. We didn't have a lot of differences of opinions. Of course we did, right? But it was never anything that caused arguments, right? So what would happen to me then when we started realizing this, of course, me in terms of like appeasing her, I went to a few meetings. Like a couple of times I'd say, yeah, maybe I ought to go to a meeting. Went to the meetings. It was the guy sitting in the back of the room, not contributing, just sort of like clocking in time more than anything else. Certainly not even talking to anybody or participating, much less even, getting involved in like step work, which later on I did. I even went as far as going to a meeting with a brother-in-law of mine who was in recovery. He had I think about 15 years at that point. I go to the meeting, I shared. I had a bunch of people come up to me after the meeting talking to me about helping me, and then I never went back, right? And on and on and on in the cycle, a long period of time once again would go by. I really didn't do anything. Like I say, quit drinking many times, sometimes actually as long as like 6 months. So I actually almost don't think that my issue was like one of a physical dependency. It was what they say in the AA program about mental obsession more than anything else. Every single time it would happen, I would get all kinds of apologetic to her. Then the cycle would just sort of start itself all over again. What I would say is when I finally hit the wall, I'll say, and hopefully have quit for good, it was about 2 years and 9 months ago, very much like right around the beginning of the pandemic. And I know Chris has heard some of this story in the past. What the catalyst sort of was for me quitting was another one of these arguments with my wife. And, you know, each time it was her confronting me about my drinking, me denying over and over. But there was something about this one time. This is sort of like, for me, when I look back, why I almost want to hit myself in the head sometimes for not noticing these things and placing, again, we'll call it an obsession, but placing such a priority on drinking over everything else. Like that was the driver in my life at the time. And, but what happened on this thing, I remember we were in our bedroom and it was like the same drill, right? You know, she came in, she was talking to me about my drinking as well as like money spent, because it was kind of obvious that I was spending money to support that habit. And I'll just say that I saw a deeper sadness instead of just the anger that I always saw before. And it's funny because all the time that I was drinking, I knew it was going to come to an end in some form or fashion, right? I knew either I was going to end up divorced or end up losing my job or end up killing somebody or end up dead. All those sort of things. I knew it was going to end. And I almost feel like I'm lucky that it ended with that kind of argument, and maybe that I had that half a second where I saw what was happening to her, where I said to her, I got to really do something about this. The irony is, it goes to show you where our relationship was. I saw that look. She walked out of our bedroom. I had to text her. It was almost easier for me to do that than go try to have this conversation, for me to turn around and admit that I had this problem. So she was aware of a rehab where her best friend, who ironically, her husband's name is Charlie. Charlie had went to a rehab, right? But Charlie went to the residence, part. I went to the partial hospitalization, which ultimately becomes IOP, which ultimately becomes OP, outpatient. And actually that's, well, I'll go off from there. And by the way, if you had told me that I'd be there 2 or 3 weeks short of a year. So this was going on around the time, again, like we said earlier, that COVID kicked in, right? So here it was the end of February of 2020. I should say at this point, I'm a sales director for a pretty large company that's got, global presence, but I'm a sales director for the US, right? So 50 states, a lot of travel, et cetera, et cetera. At the time, I was a regional manager, so I had the Northeast. So I had 13 states, but again, multiple salespeople working for me. Well, what happened was I go into the rehab, and because the country went into lockdown, a lot of the travel for us really shut down. And a lot of people would say at the time, oh, this gives me more opportunity to drink. This is like stories that I heard when I was in the rehab. And for me, it was kind of the opposite, because here I am at home. My wife is home. I really consider myself very fortunate because for me, it was like the availability and the opportunities kind of shrank around the time that I was just starting to get my feet under me in terms of sobriety, even if it was just a couple of weeks. So that was a good thing. But I did have one trip planned. I had to go drive out to Pittsburgh. When I went out there, again, my therapist was like prepping me. What are you going to do? You need, like you could just say, hey, I have to make a phone call and excuse yourself from dinner. You could say, I'm feeling a little under the weather. You could say, I'm on antibiotics, so I can't drink tonight, right? Probably all these things that we read about if we're involved in any kind of program. So I chose the antibiotics, right? So I'll take that off the menu. And I used it that night, and it's a perfectly good excuse. But obviously, it's not one of those things you can use forever. I can't be on antibiotics forever. So I don't know about you guys, but that's sort of an excuse that wears thin. So I did that, came back, everything was fine. And then because of what the situation was in the world and less travel and people working from home, my sales role and going out and seeing customers who didn't want people in their offices sort of confined me to a work at home, Teams calls, Teams call mania, by the way. just working my way through that. So I didn't have to worry about all these like situations. But again, I knew that day would come where the rules would relax and we'd be back to the norm. Funny thing happened along the way. So, like I said, I was a regional manager, and then I got promoted about 4 months later. Now, the fact that I was sober for 4 months, whether that's a coincidence or not, or my performance improved, whatever it was, I don't know. But I do thank God that that occurred when I was sober, because I would have self-destructed based on all the added pressures, some of the things that we just mentioned briefly as we started here, or maybe just before we started. What I had done prior to that was I had made a decision that everybody that was in my personal life, I was going to inform what my situation was, that I was in a rehab. I had to go do this. My drinking had got out of hand. And a lot of people, of course, the people that are really going to support you, right? Your friends will be your friends, et cetera. And your family, certainly will be supportive. I think in probably almost every case, the professional side of the business, I was so worried about what might people think, that whole stigma thing that happens, right? How would that affect my standing in the company for both presently as well as future, trust, all that kind of stuff because, hey, once upon a time, I had an opinion of what an alcoholic looked like and acted like and everything else. I don't know if there's a singular stereotype, but there's certainly a stigma that exists. So again, I didn't want to inform anybody on my professional side. And again, had a bunch of conversations with our therapist about this. I didn't want anybody really to know in the beginning. And so that took me back to, okay, how am I going to deal with this now? Like, what could I say? What was my reason for quitting? If I was really going to do this, would that lead to like a million questions? Or would they figure out that, hey, maybe Charlie has a problem, right? So I did come up with some excuses and like different ideas on things to say because what I wanted to do was sort of soft play it. Right. I didn't want to say, hey, I got a problem, I had to go to rehab. That certainly wasn't going to go down that path. So the way I tried to do this is, I came up with a couple of things. Like some people almost use like humor, like jokes. Hey, when I drink, I break out in handcuffs, or the world's a safer place when I don't drink, all these sort of things. But I did start with a few people saying that, hey, look, we don't really drink much at home. And so I haven't been drinking a lot. But I haven't had a drink in 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever it is. And I feel better. By the way, 100% true. And that's what I told a lot of people, in the beginning. And the big fear for me was, okay, is this going to lead to, the Spanish Inquisition about this thing? Am I going to get a million questions? And is it going to really get very invasive for me? But then I turned around and like some of the guys that I was like closest with, and hey, every time I went to Boston, I'd hook up with this guy, or every time I went to Philadelphia, whatever it was, I just said to a few of them that I might have been overdoing it. Yeah, I feel better, blah, blah, blah. But I might have like slipped in there. I might have been overdoing it. Now, some of those people may have been like, yeah, you're right. Nobody really approached me like that, though. And when I offered that one singular thing, and I'm just saying that this is the one that like seemed to be the most effective for me. When I offered that one singular thing, nobody came back to me with like deep dive questions on it. I could just say, hey, I feel better. I feel healthier. Hey, by the way, the new job that I have, I can't afford to wake up any day feeling less than. Like I didn't have to go down these long paths by saying that. And that was a huge, huge relief. I can think of one person in particular who almost looked at it like a curiosity. And he almost said a ridiculous thing to me where he said, hey, how did you quit when the pandemic made alcoholics out of a lot of people? As if the pandemic made people alcoholics, right? So that was the thing. So I think really that's about it, right? That's kind of what we wanted to talk about in general. I guess my main point would be is that the fear is stronger than what the reality is, at least in my experience. right? When I tell you I fretted about that and I worried about that, it was first and foremost self-manufactured stress, as it turns out. And then here's the other thing. I haven't anybody, once I've said that, really try to push a drink on me. So I might sit down at a table and somebody will say, hey, what do you want to drink? Blah, blah, blah. I'll get my seltzer with lemon or, a Diet Coke or an iced tea or whatever it may be. But again, having offered why I'm not drinking, I haven't had that experience.
For the viewers, I met Charlie kind of early in my IOP duration and at the end of Charlie's duration. And I specifically remember the first day I came in and I was ranting and raving about pretty much the same things. Charlie and a couple other people, Alan, who we've had on the show, and a few others, I was raving about how I can't work anymore and my wife. And I just remember you and a couple other people, you're like, it'll be okay. We were you 8 months ago or 9 months ago or whatever it was. So I got a lot of good knowledge that you guys soaked up from that previous 9 months before I got there. I think you really helped me with my wife and with work. I was one of those people, because this is my second or third time out of rehab, and I was one of those people that would make up excuses and say, I cannot do my job without drinking, which is complete and utter bullshit. It's just complete and utter bullshit. I would say, oh, well, we go to these client dinners. I have to drink. I found out recently people just don't care. I think that's the underlying thing, is people care about themselves more than others.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. I think that if you're sitting down with, of course, we're talking about the workplace. If you're sitting down and you're meeting with people or eating with people that don't know you, to pass on a drink, it's the easiest thing in the world. It really is. Most people won't go, well, like even like bat an eye, but we think they're all like wondering about us, right? But yeah, it's a different story when you're with people that have seen you in action and you overcome that.
So speaking of that, one thing that I did find interesting and I learned a lot from was your progression up to the Pittsburgh trip. And our therapist helped you develop a plan. So for our viewers, why don't you walk us through kind of what a typical plan for a night? And that would be really, I think, helpful for some people out there, is what is a plan you can make for a situation that you're going to be around alcohol? Because that's kind of what that 4-week buildup was.
It comes down to getting away, right? They always say people, places, things. It's about getting away. So, you sit down to a dinner. If the pressure starts to ramp up, you get away. If you start to feel a little squirrely, you get away, right? I think those are sort of the principal things, is to, find excuses that pull you away from whatever that situation is. Unless you're in a position where you do want to just say, hey, you know what? It depends on your audience, right? But if you actually wanted to say, hey, I just quit a little while ago and I feel uncomfortable. I don't know many people that would do that. I really don't. I would admire anybody who could. But again, I would worry for myself about stigma. The one thing about the business that I'm in, on one hand, I can say it's very, it's a large, it's tied to construction, so it's a very large business. But it's also very sort of incestuous, where it's always the same people moving around, company to company and whatnot. So it's always the same cast of characters, and there's always sort of like a rumor mill that's associated. Too much drama, but I don't want to be part of that.
I think you made so many good points in there, Charlie. I think that the plan that someone has is personal to them. Just like you said, have someone call you, or you call someone before you go into an event, and call someone after an event. Make up an excuse. And I love that you said that, because it's personal and it's something that is easy and something that a lot of people can do. Also, and this ties to other people seeing you not drinking and saying that you're not drinking at a work event, I think that it's all about our perception of ourselves. no one else makes a big deal of it if we are not drinking at an event, but we do because that's the obsession of it, right? And so if I say, hey, I just got a call, I got to run, or hey, I have to go let the dog out, or whatever it is, people aren't going to worry about that. They're going to be like, okay, that sounds normal to me, right? And just keep it moving. But we get so tied up in our heads and worried about what other people are thinking that we forget that we're doing this for ourselves. And I think that's huge.
When Chris talks about having a plan, I think having a plan takes more pressure off of you, right? Because if you're, going to be plunged into a situation like that, you're already going to feel a certain amount of stress, right? How am I going to deal with this? What are they going to say? What are they going to think, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have a plan, you're not fumbling for an answer. You're not, like you already have it, right? And so you end up ultimately just taking more pressure off yourself, right? More stress off yourself. So I think it's a very wise thing. And I think it's a healthy thing.
I actually was thinking about, I'm in the construction world as well, and when I re-entered my new job, which I got just out of rehab, I kind of ripped the Band-Aid off and just said, listen, I'm sober now. And since that point, no one's offered me a drink, and I still go to these golf events, dinners, all this stuff. And I think that was the best decision for me at the time. It was a new company, and it is very incestuous. It's a rotating, so... And it's funny that you say that because I remember I got a call from like an old boss's. It got back to me within like 2 weeks that I said that. But it was actually someone saying how happy they are. And that's another thing. Once you say you're sober, everyone knows somebody that's sober. And that's the first thing that everyone goes to. Oh, my wife's sister's brother's dog's owner is sober.
It is kind of funny, and it's like this is like looking at it now, looking backwards. But if a certain percentage of our population has this disease, right? And oh, by the way, that was another thing is that when again in IOP and OP, et cetera, when we were calling this a disease, I remember having this conversation with my sponsor. I felt like that was a cop out for my behavior. Like I was going to go home and say to my wife, guess what? I've had a disease. That's what it is. It's fine. It's fine. I don't, I'm working on my disease, but I don't, just to me, it was one of those things.
I've definitely used that one to my wife, and it's definitely not, it doesn't get you out of jail.
Oh, no, it doesn't. I didn't even want to use it. Like I said, I felt like it was lame, although I know it's not, right? And as I got a little more sobriety under my belt and, and you hear more and more people talk in meetings and surrounding yourself with sober people, you really come to realize it's not just an excuse and it's certainly not lame, right? It's just, that's where my mind was, right? Like I can cure all my problems. I can quit drinking just like I had 25 times before. And this time it's going to be permanent because, X, Y, Z. And it just never was.
So Charlie, I have a question for you around managing stress. So I look back in my professional career and I remember times where I was literally doing lines of crystal meth and taking shots of Fireball in my office before meetings because I thought that I'd be on the ball for it. And I'd be staying up all night working on proposals, working on presentations, thinking that I was killing it. The bad part is that I was actually getting praise for it. That was how I was handling the stress of my job. I felt like a minnow in the ocean. And I'm wondering how you now, as a sober man, deal with the stress without going down to that bar in the hotel or picking up a free scotch on the plane or whatever it is.
Yeah, so as maybe you can imagine in my role, fair amount of presenting goes on. An interesting thing happened to me in terms of the stress, right? So I do a fair amount of presenting in a sales role with our company. And what started happening to me, and I felt like it came out of nowhere, was let's say you were at a multi-day conference, you go out, you get slammed the night before, you get a big presentation the next day. Sort of similar to like what you're describing, right? Well, I would get up and I would start to experience like nerves like I never had before. And sometimes it was like that physical kind of reaction from being hungover. Sometimes I almost felt like I almost felt like a fraud, if you can understand that. Like the person that is standing in front of, and that started playing on me to the point where I started all of a sudden getting nerved up, like in a big way around these presentations. Once I had quit drinking, and I kid you not, once I had quit drinking, and again, I had sort of the benefit of being home for a little while, but I got back out, on the road and sort of got back into that mode. My stress was gone because I wasn't feeling like crap getting up in front of an audience, number one. And by the way, that hangover effect was just making me a ball of nerves all the time. So actually quitting reduced my stress. Not that I easily deal with stress today, but I'm able to sort of like manage it even more like internally. And yeah, I do those things. I get up and I go for a walk, or I take a little break, or I actually more often than not, if it's just sort of like a business issue, I'll plow through it. One of the things is, and I never read the book, but my sponsor talks about a book that I think it's called Eat the Frog. So I think what the book boils down to is, imagine you have a plate of fruit and you've got to eat everything on the plate, but there's a frog on that plate. What do? You eat the frog, because you're going to be staring at that frog, thinking about that frog all the while you're eating all the other stuff. So eat the frog and get it over with. And that's sort of like the way I approach like my day. When I get up and I've got 25 things to do, but one thing is like nagging and bothering me and all that, I eat the frog.
I like that. I've never heard that. I as well had that imposter syndrome that you were talking about, like you don't deserve to be there. And you've talked very extensively about planning and sobriety in the workforce. I think all three of us had a different experience. You started to talk about your sponsor and step work. How has sobriety as a whole affected your career since you got promoted? Or do you attribute kind of recovery for your promotion? I know you kind of said you don't know if it was coincidence, but how has it helped you in the recent period of time?
I truly don't know if one led to the other. I'd like to think not, because again, that was like a 4-month period from, A to Z, when I did get promoted, but I've been with this company for, again, for decades, right? So, I'd like to think I had a body of work that sort of led, then once the opportunity occurred, then all that. I don't even suspect. I think if I was still drinking, like I said, I would have self-destructed. Just under the pressure, I would have just sort of like, if I had a bottle to comfort me through a lot of those things that were going on. Oh, by the way, let's remember we were in a pandemic and there was supply chain this and all that. So it was like the worst possible time. I know I would have self-destructed, which, by the way, I'm not just talking about from, a job perspective. As bad as things were with my family, and very much in particular with my wife, probably a good chance we'd be done, especially after that one particular event that I was mentioning.
So, Charlie, thank you so much for sharing your experience in what I think a lot of our viewers deal with on a daily basis, trying to insert our recovery into our careers and trying to have that recovery professional life balance and blend. I really identified with a lot that you said tonight. I could see myself in so many different situations that you were referring to. One last question that I have for you is, we like to give, our experience, strength, and hope to the people who listen to our show. And I want to know if you had to give one piece of advice to a newcomer or to someone who might need it, who has years of recovery in the bank, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think for me, it was if you have truly surrendered, like truly surrendering, truly giving up, it would be to take any and all suggestions that are offered to you. Well, first of all, my suggestion would be to work a program, right? Not just try to white knuckle it. If you're truly surrendering, get into a 12-step program and just follow the instructions. You have an instruction book, follow them, give it up, fight your own self-will, just admit that's what you need to do. Because that's, at least to date, that has been what's worked for me.
That is awesome. That's excellent advice and something that changed my entire program. It wasn't until I surrendered that I started to get all of the things in life that were coming to me through my recovery program.
Yeah, it happens. Get a good sponsor and let the sponsor guide you.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on tonight. We really appreciate it. It was nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. Nice meeting you, and best of luck to you guys going forward.
And as always, each and every one of our episodes is dedicated to the still sick and suffering alcoholic and addict, especially the individual who's going to pick up for the first time tonight. Have a great night, guys.
We appreciate your liking and subscribing to our podcast. If you liked what you heard today and would like to support our podcast, feel free to Venmo $1 to our virtual basket at Sober Solutions Podcast. We want to hear from you too. If you have a comment, question, topic, or would like to come on the show, find us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Sober Solutions Podcast. Or you can shoot us an email to sobersolutionspodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you like what you've heard, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show.